Hi, folks. Welcome to another Omnist Hour. On again pretty quick after yesterday's long slugfest because let me get this music down. I actually didn't cover everything I wanted to get to yesterday, and overnight got some inspiration of what I need to fill in. So bear with me. I'm not going to go back and review much. I'm going to pretty much start from where we left off yesterday. The title of this talk I've decided is going to be Apocalypse Now, and Then, and Here, and There, and Everywhere. The idea being to give you a further idea of why there's so many predictions of what's going to happen in this special time. So many prophecies that seem to be somewhat inconsistent with each other and caused a lot of consternation in arguments between religionists and non-religionists of various persuasions. Okay, let's see. That music may still be just a tad too loud. Decided to use a piece that I haven't used before because it sounded kind of triumphant, and I hope that there will be some points in this talk that will give you a sense of triumph. Let's get our whiteboard back on here. Okay, so it's adding to yesterday. The things that we didn't touch on are going to be things that go between, as you may remember from previous talks, what we're in the process of is a fundamental shift in the government of heaven, if you will, the whole multiverse, which is essentially all of heaven. There's no such thing as hell. There's no such thing as heaven. There are just basically different ways to experience pieces of the multiverse. Okay? So, as I mentioned before, we're shifting from an organization that is kind of like a stacked pyramid, where if you want to be a god, you've got to rise to the top of a pyramid, which is pretty much how government in human organizations has worked up to the current point. And I guess the challenge of governance has been to try to come up with ways that act less like a pyramid and give folks at the bottom more of a say in what goes on at the top. As anybody that is aware of pyramids knows, it's a very stable but a very rigid way of governing. Okay, now what we've been talking about is the new organization of the multiverse, at least the soul part of the multiverse, the spiritual part of the multiverse, as basically a progression through states of consciousness, which can be represented by states that are physical. These are the states that we experience when we are incarnated in the physical world. There's a pyramid of states spiritually, which represent the integration of all of our physical experience, and if we have any, all of our God experience eventually. And this is the point that I didn't get to earlier. And then there's this third level, 4 levels here, 4 levels here, 4 levels here, so a total of 12 levels of spiritual attainment or consciousness. This last pyramid are the God levels, where you have a consciousness in the new system that has a portion of it that operates by the God rules. Okay, so imagine, if you will, that let's use God as an example. okay, as I've been telling you, the whole seventh day of creation story, 7-day creation story, is really about 6 days of basically all the senior creators, the Elohim, working together to build the framework for the final testing of karma on the planet Earth. And the stories leading up to that, and other stories that are captured in Hindu and uh, Sumerian legends, mythology, mytho-history, are basically about how those first 6 days were set up. The Genesis story is actually, in some respects, better mapping to the truth than the others that don't really lay it out in terms of a progression of steps taken by creators, Elohim, to set up the earth for this grand experiment. The final phase of it, well, not really the final phase, but the final proof of this new law in God's universe, the law of karma. Okay, so yesterday I think I mentioned to you that when you become a god in the new system, you have your own, you have the realization that you now have your own universe of creation. Now that universe of creation for each individual soul actually exists as kind of a timeout zone. You're not really aware of it until you get to the God level, and even when you get to the God level, you're not completely in control of it until you get to the senior creator level, the 12th level of godhood. Okay, so what happens when you're working within the system of karma? And again, it's being tested in God's universe now within the Gaia experiment. So within the boundaries of our planet, our solar system, this little isolated corner of the physical universe where this experiment has been percolating for quite some time. However, before it was introduced to God's universe, God had his own test universe where the original idea was conceived, kind of in secret, because our private universe is just that. It's a place for time out where other souls are not welcome unless they're invited. And since you're not aware of your private universe until you become a god, there really are no other souls there except for virtual souls, the ones that are there to make you think while you're in this timeout universe that you're actually in the same universe you were in. Okay? And that process of switching is something that we've been working very heavily on in recent years, trying to take the glitches out of it, because as people become more conscious, they notice some weird feeling when they're switching between universes, when they're being swapped out with their virtual soul alter ego, so that they don't screw up any of the important experiments that are going on in God's universe. Okay, so how does this work then? Well, what are the implications? So, is God has fully tested karma already. Now, one of the things that you might have realized if you understand that is that means that in God's private universe, where he has himself and a whole bunch of virtual souls representing every soul in the multiverse, since every soul in the multiverse was essentially a creation of God at some point, or a child of a child, a part of the family, if you will. Okay, so when God created this experiment, he was at the 12th level. He had never incarnated yet. He had thought up the experiment before trying it out on himself. So God was fully aware of this other universe and was fully aware of all the virtual souls in it, and was able to experiment with new versions of virtual souls as other souls who had started incarnating in the first 6 days of this experiment, who had reached different levels of achievement. And even the ones who had reached the God level of achievement, and was able to communicate with them, if he wished, to share bits and pieces of what was going on. So this is essentially how God has been active, even though the seventh day was supposed to be a day of rest, and kind of was, in that God was incarnating. Virtual souls were being updated, created, and when they reached godhood, so when souls reached the God levels in this new system, they started getting informed, yes, you have your own universe now. You can do your creation. But if you create outside of the plan, if you think karma is a bad idea still, you're going to be creating stuff in your own private universe that's not going to get integrated into this experiment. That's perfectly okay. If they want to do that, fine. You can be a dark god. Dark gods aren't necessarily bad per se. They just want to continue to push on ideas that God has rejected already. Now, that doesn't mean they'll always be rejected. A dark god may have an idea that one day will light up all the lights in the Senior Creators Council and get them to say, you know what, I think we're going to make so-and-so's universe the prime universe now. And, thanks everybody who's worked on the first prime universe. Thank you, God. You can retire now, go off to your own universe, and we'll take it from here. And if you want to play in the new prime universe that we've agreed on, then you play just like any other player, and maybe you can earn your spot back as the prime universe. Now, when you're creating in the prime universe, you have a special set of rules that go on, and the owner of the prime universe is kind of like, this is the current top god. If you're creating in these other universes, you can either create things that are based upon a version of God's universe and are just like variations on a theme, or you can roll your own and start all over if you want to go through and create your own version of the Big Bang and what happened after that and blah, 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 and blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. And in fact, there are players already who have accepted their first version of karma who are already playing that game. This is where all the antimatter is. That hasn't found a way to exist in God's universe. God's universe is a universe, as we know, of positive matter. We can create antiparticles either through our human experiments or certain processes of nature create antiparticles, which generally fairly quickly annihilate and don't build clumps of antimatter to our knowledge. Although there may certainly be the isolated star or whatever that happens to be made up of antimatter. Jury's still out on that one. At any rate, what this means in practical terms, I'm going to explain in a little more detail. Okay, so while the experiment has been approved in God's alternate universe, as I've told you, you can't really apply that to the whole multiverse unless you integrate it into what's agreed is the current prime universe, which is a pretty hard thing to change. You've got to basically get all the senior creators to agree that this new idea is worthy of letting the creator of it become God effectively. Okay, so what does this mean in practical terms? What it means is, as God started to incarnate, when the seventh day of creation started, and God said, look, okay, I've got this really good idea that I'm going to show all the other creators. I know you're going to think I'm crazy, but I got this idea about karma. And I've tested it out in my universe, and I think it's ready for prime time. And he laid out what he wanted to tell them of it, which wasn't everything. When you're selling an idea, you don't air everything. You put out a sales pitch, and God's a pretty good PR guy, like a lot of the PR folks of big global multinational corporations. When they want to come out with a earth-shattering new product that you've just got to buy, like a virus or a vaccine, they don't tell you that much about it. They might not even tell you anything about it. All of the sales pitches might be given in behind closed doors to a bunch of other CEOs that could stand to benefit from introducing that product. Well, God's not above that either. God just doesn't really have a profit motive in terms of monetary gain, power. God's motive is creation, is taking care of his family, making his family more functional, making the playing ground more even for the newest members, so that they don't, if you've got a new precocious young soul born that seems to have a lot of potential, they don't have to knock themselves out for eons working their way up a pyramid to become one of the senior gods. And that's the way things were in the old system. And that's why the old system, the versions of karma that didn't include this new structure, this virtual soul feature, seemed very unfair. And that's why the Buddhists, the Buddhas of the multiverse, and the human one was not the first one by any stretch of the imagination. First Buddha came from another planet on the far side of the galaxy. The earlier, from an earlier experiment, which I touched on yesterday, I think. At any rate, this earlier version of karma that was in the process of implementation. So, as I told you, this whole idea of karma has been around for a long time. It's been around as long as the idea of reincarnation, the idea of physical incarnation. God sold the idea by telling most of the senior creators, look, this is a chance to go enjoy your creations firsthand, to experience what it's like to be a star, to be a plant, to be a planet, whatever, and to actually be part of your creation and feel the creation rather than just watch it sort of remotely. This physical incarnation idea was pretty popular. It was like video games, social media, the metaverse today, being sold by people that don't tell you the dark side, that, well, you know, you might just get so sucked into this that you can't get out. That's kind of how karma works, as new facets of it are revealed to the participants. All the facets were developed in God's universe, God's secret universe, not the prime universe, God's experimental universe, before it was implemented here, before the senior creators were talked into the whole experiment centered around, well, a series of experiments, actually, because when God first told them of this idea, he was only telling them about the reincarnation part, and that you could physically incarnate, and then added more little pieces of the story as new experiments, although the whole experiment was thought out basically with the idea of the Milky Way, or the idea of the Big Bang even, and just fleshed out as infrastructure was prepared to sell a new phase of the experiment. Now, the final phase that God waited the longest to tell everybody about was this whole thing about virtual souls and virtual universes. Now, virtual souls have existed for a long time. A virtual soul started existing when the first God civilization decided, you know what, the only way we're going to stop fighting with each other is by basically taking the best and most perfect one of us and making that the repository of our consciousness, the repository of all our souls, the only one that makes all the decisions and just orders all the others about, and then we'll have perfection because we've got one central authority making all the decisions. Sounds a lot like versions of God that a lot of folks have imagined might work while God was off sleeping, doesn't it? This authoritarian micromanager of the universe that's going to make everything perfect. Of course, they weren't the only civilization that thought of that, and there are many hive-minded civilizations out there, only one of which was the first, which God kept around and filled them in on a little bit more of the plan, their leader, and made them aware of the deeper plan. And they became, I think I touched on this yesterday, they became kind of God's spies, the observers. Okay, so once God starts incarnating, though, actually participating in this personally, in the final version of it, because, you know, he broke this up into several experiments and introduced them one at a time. So this final phase of the seventh day of creation, not really a final phase, there are going to be 12 days total for perfecting this, because the seventh day is just finishing the implementation of this last piece of the puzzle, karma puzzle, the virtual souls, virtual universe piece, and implementing it locally on this planet. Okay, so when God starts incarnating in this system, incarnation number one, under this final set of rules, God has reincarnation amnesia, starts at the same spot everybody else has, and doesn't have a lot of experience being human. So God makes a lot of mistakes. God commits a lot of sins. Now, since this is God incarnating in God's universe, when God commits a sin and does something that is inconsistent with God's plan, what would God do, a fully aware God, do in God's universe? That creates a virtual soul that replaces God for a period of time. God's consciousness goes to live in God's experimental universe, and this virtual soul comes and finishes out the remainder of that incarnation. So basically, while this whole experiment was going on, God has been creating many, many, many virtual soul copies of himself at different levels of awareness. Okay, so let's think about some of the God incarnations that didn't quite make it to the finish line. Let's talk about this fella Jesus. Now, Jesus, the real Jesus, the inspiration for all of the offshoots of Christianity, for better or worse, who knows what civilization that person came from, whether it was before or after the flood. The Bible isn't necessarily history. It's a version of history written by perhaps people that were listening to a version of God that was not fully awake. So, the earlier prophets in the Bible may have been God incarnated at one of these levels of consciousness. Maybe even in physical level, where it's like, well, these are the settled laws that people should live by if they want to be good people. And I don't know if there is a God, but this is the law. Okay, now this Jesus incarnation, I would say, was God's first incarnation where he actually got back to this first level of godhood. And if you remember what I was talking about, the God levels, this first level is a level of, oh man, I'm a God. I've got all this power. I can do miracles. I can see the future. I have all these capabilities. I must be the God. But Jesus didn't say that. He was always talking about the Father. Well, where do we get our inspiration from? We get it from our spirit. As God was progressing through this system, who would be his natural spiritual guide? God himself. The God that is living in this private universe, watching from the private universe. And this is the deal here. The spirit exists in all these three worlds. It starts existing only in the physical world and having like a level 0 in these other worlds. So it doesn't have any awareness or any consciousness in these other worlds. After one incarnation, it starts building the lowest level of spiritual consciousness. When the life review happens, and then as more incarnations happen, a more full set of physical incarnation experiences is built up, which inform a more full spiritual consciousness. And eventually, when both of those are full enough, one gets a chance to experience a God consciousness. Okay, so let's think about this Jesus fella. He passed the test of getting past thinking, well, I'm the only God, or there is no God, which is kind of the existential question of people who are living a Messiah life. Am I the God because I thought up relativity? Well, Einstein was humble enough to realize, you know what, there's other people in science that have done as great things as me. Therefore, there is a God. It can't be me. I'm not sure it can be the God of the Bible because what I've been taught about the Bible doesn't lead me to believe that that's the kind of God I would want in charge of anything. God that, I mean, I'm a guy that created an idea that could create an atomic bomb. If God has that much power and creates evil, then that's not a God that I could get behind. So Einstein and most scientists will state a belief in some higher power, but don't really say for definite sure what they think that power is. They can profess to be Christians, but they certainly, when pushed, would be challenged by the eternal challenge of Christians that, okay, if God created everything, then why did he create evil? Why did he create things that could destroy and hurt and kill and maim? And, that's basically the argument that atheists use for the non-existence of God, being so stupid that they can't understand that God could be a God of freedom, a God that gives everybody, every soul created in his image, a chance to earn a creative spot every bit as powerful as the first creator, which is what I've been telling you, and explains, I think, quite well how co-creation works, much better than the arguments of folks that have this cosmic oneness point of view. Okay, I'm gonna get to more things there though. So let's talk. Just get back to Jesus. So he gets to this first level of godhood, and he struggles with maybe thinking he is a god because I can do miracles and I can do this and that. But at least according to the records of his life, whether they're accurate or not, made up, I'm not going to say, but there seem to be a lot of stories that say that he started doing miracles and his disciples started saying, oh, you must be a god. And he quickly put the kibosh in that, saying that, oh, if I have any power, I get it from my Father. Spiritual advisor. Well, I think, that would be if you only had one spiritual advisor who happened to be manifesting as another male, one could be forgiven for thinking that that advisor is a different soul, is God, instead of maybe a higher version of yourself. Now, the interesting thing is there were a lot of messianic figures that came about in this era of messianic religion. Began with, I guess, the first religions that had trinities, which I'm not sure that necessarily the Judeo-Christian tradition was the first. There's the Isis, Osiris, Horus Trinity, which is the Messianic religion. There may have been earlier ones. So who's to know when the real Jesus first existed? But that was one incarnation of God that had a very profound effect on the experiment. And many religions took their birth in pieces of that incarnation's revelation. And that's why there are so many different human religions with little bits and pieces of this grander truth that I'm sharing with you. Let's talk about the end of Jesus' life. So, remember what the last words were. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Now it's interesting that not my Father, why hast thou forsaken me? My God, why hast thou forsaken me? I think there was a point in Jesus' journey where he had the challenge to identify this advisor as a higher version of himself, or to disidentify with this spiritual advisor as his father. And okay, if you're not my father, you must be some God that I've disappointed. And he fell back to basically lack of faith in himself, decided, well, maybe I'm just another Jew that is not really respecting God or has done something to offend God. What I've done was all a mistake. And that is the despairing act, in my opinion, that caused the Jesus incarnation to fail in the plan and create a virtual soul. The virtual soul pops into God's universe, into the Gaia experiment. And this is essentially the virtual soul version of Jesus that is seen by people after the crucifixion. This is a spiritual version of Jesus who tells of things that were not mentioned before and may have shown up not only to his followers in one place, but may have shown up to potential followers all over the world before that life, that incarnation was actually ended. And after the crucifixion, this soul was doing what God would do, because that's what virtual souls do when they kick into God's universe. So that's when the real preaching began, after the crucifixion. And only those that saw Jesus after the crucifixion got the real story. And probably most of them were very confounded by what they heard, because this was a different Jesus. And many of them didn't listen, or said, okay, well, let's just tell the part about rising after the third day, and let's leave out all the other weird shit he told us, because that's going to get us crucified too, for sure. And so other parts of the world might have gotten different pieces of that when this virtual soul version of Jesus came to call. Perhaps in India, in the Hindu area, the idea of reincarnation and karma sounded pretty good, but this whole thing about everybody getting to have a Messiah life, that sounds kind of seditious. I mean, that's going to get people all uppity and think that they, gosh, even an untouchable could one day be a Messiah. The guy that's washing your feet could actually be a god in disguise. Ooh, that's kind of scary. I think we're going to cut that part out. Maybe except for, a small group of people that we teach the higher mysteries. And this is the essence of where the mystery schools come from in different religions. And why in recent years, as comparative religion has become a very interesting topic, that some people have begun combining the ideas of various mystery schools into trying to come up with a philosophical religion that is more universal than what's come before. Not necessarily realizing that all of this religious experience is actually based on real spiritual experience, not just the simple spiritual experience of your first encounter with the bright light and the feeling of connectedness. One of the other characteristics of these incarnations of God during the seventh day, wherever God gets to in an incarnation, kind of establishes a nexus. Whatever God happens to, where God happens to land physically, temporally, and how much spiritual awareness God gets, and what's the focus of that, because God could incarnate and happen to decide in this lifetime, gosh, I just want to be an artist. I want to draw pretty pictures. I want to make music. I want to be a healer. I want to be a king, a conqueror. And depending on, how God gets through the physical levels of a life to find out that he has some spiritual nature, perhaps even some God nature, that might lead to an incarnation of God where God reaches some level of godhood, but not the full awareness of his complete history. Okay, so think about history. We touched a bit on this yesterday. There have been people in history that just seem to be gifted. They've got some gift of creating music, creating theories, creating organizations, creating empires that seems to defy all logic, all possibility, to the point where those people are looked at almost as gods. At least up to a point where their death, their sudden loss of success, causes everybody to doubt. Now, we talked about one such personage, Alexander the Great, yesterday. I'm pretty sure that Alexander the Great was an incarnation of God, because there's the history there is so well documented, all the twists and turns that got this one person be the ruler of the known world by the age of 34. It's just, it's a miracle, right? It's miraculous, and people believe, even though he died young, that he was one of these hero gods that had been part of legend that they hadn't had experience of in a while, but every culture had a memory of a time when there seemed to be like a god king of the thing, which eventually, these god kings eventually died, but while they were alive, they seemed to just have this golden touch, as long as they didn't run up against another god king that seemed to have more power and defeated them. And you look at the portions of the Bible, the Sumerian legends, the Hindu legends, there's a lot of that kind of a personage. And in the Hindu tradition, they even go so far as, this personage must have been the 11th incarnation of Vishnu, or whatever. So they even make up mythology about that sort of maps to this. And maybe it does map to it, because, as I've told you, God's not the only one advancing along these paths. Other souls, other God-level souls, have chosen to incarnate and test this new idea out. Some of them did it at the same time God did, saying, "Okay, I'll go with you, God. If you're going to take that leap of faith, I'm going to take it too, in solidarity." And others hung back, either because it's like, okay, these guys are nuts. While they're gone trying out this new law, we're going to go to town. And maybe others who held back saying, well, gosh, let me think. If I follow God into this thing, then I'm going to be kind of like I'm sleeping for a while, waking up again. And what are all these other guys going to do while I'm sleeping and waking up? And maybe I better just hang back and have God's back while he's trying out this experiment. So there is a large number of souls, even God-level souls, even senior creators, that are still working in this pyramid system, keeping their place, maybe even moving up a few notches because other gods have incarnated. And this pyramid system, as I mentioned, has still been active until the final phase of the Gaia experiment and God's incarnation himself. So there are new gods in this pyramid and new pyramids within the pyramid. And there's been a gradual realization that the most important thing going on in the multiverse right now is this experiment that God is conducting. And so this pyramid has been undergoing a lot of gyration of old gods getting supplanted by new gods that are children training. And this is why, in the oldest history, the oldest stories, we have gods that are like, oh, this god is the sun, this god is the moon, this god is this star, that star. Okay, those are old gods before the whole before the final rule of karma came into play that allowed souls to rise to godhood through this system. Now, what triggered that? So while God was incarnating, until God got a chance to be a god again, first reached the god level again, any other souls working within this were kind of stuck at going from this level 1 to level 8. And that got frustrating because when they get to level 8, they know that they want to go somewhere else, but there's nowhere else to go. And that creates a lot of tension, a lot of frustration. And that's when these budding gods can cause cataclysms that upset the experiment and reset for a new phase of the Gaia experiment. So again, as I've told you several times, it's not God who's been destroying the world. It's perhaps somewhat God's fault because other souls are like pushing at the door, wanting to become gods, but God hasn't figured it out yet. So I think the last major extinction event, which was the comet that ended the last ice age, you can read all about if you follow the work of Graham Hancock and some of the other folks that are proving that the traditional idea of history not beginning, the history of civilization not beginning till after the ice age, maybe about 6,000 years ago. That's bullshit. It's just a different phase of civilization, because in that phase of civilization, we got to this point of gods ready to move on, and destructions didn't happen because God had moved on, and now these budding new gods were able to move into God position, but not within the full awareness of this new system. So still thinking that they're part of this pyramid system. So this old pyramid system has been starting to be eroded by gods grown up in this new system. And that's only started happening since the last ice age. And that, I mean, if you look at the history of that period, I can't go into everything, or I'd be talking for 2 or 3 hours again, and I want to keep it a little bit more succinct today. But if you look at the history of humanity after the last big cataclysm, there was a near wipeout of, and actual wipeout of many of the larger species on the Earth. All the larger mammals, except for a few, were wiped out. The woolly mammoth, the saber-toothed tiger, the giant sloth, etc., etc. And seemingly, most of the giant hominid specimens, which are apparently a subspecies of humanity. Maybe the subspecies that has the most DNA remaining from the god species that created humanity. And as the larger hominids were the ones that were hit hardest, this basically accelerated the process of humanity's remaining god blood dying out. And the final stage of humanity beginning where, you know what, all of the godlike powers that we used to have to be able to build out of stone as if it was programmable concrete, which is basically what a lot of the megalithic structures that we're finding now look like, so well built that we don't even know how we could do it today. Fitted so well and with such precision and interesting patterns and shapes that it's like you'd have to be a god to figure this out. Why would you do this? How would you do it? And actually, if you look at, get a structural engineer to look at these things, you'll say, well, it's obvious why they did this. This kind of construction is built to last through any earthquake, because it doesn't have any set resonances that if you just hit the right frequency, this thing is going to topple. And if you look at modern buildings, they haven't got that yet. I was staying, first time I went to China on a preview trip, I was staying in the Jinmao Tower, which at the time was the tallest building in the world. And while I was there on my preview trip, on the 72nd, 74th floor, 70-something floor, one of the top floors anyway, before the upper area that was like businesses and restaurants and fancy places for bigwigs to hang out. Anyway, I was on one of the top hotel floors of this building when a 20-year worst typhoon hit Shanghai. This was back in 2000, late 2003, early 2004, somewhere in there. And literally, this building was swaying back and forth like a tuning fork, swaying at least 20 or 30 feet from side to side from where in my room. And it was kind of scary being in that building then. And I can imagine that if the storm were a little bit worse, that and hitting this fundamental frequency that the building liked to vibrate at, that eventually that building would collapse. And certainly many, many buildings that are not structurally built for earthquakes do collapse. Even ones that are built for earthquakes that just aren't built smart. Now these stone structures like the pyramid, the Sphinx, some of the other megalithic structures all over the world, they're built with these weird, irregular patterns of stones that are not just like, a standard brick lattice. They don't have rebar any steel reinforcement. But these stones have stood through, in areas where there are frequent earthquakes, have stood for a long, long time and lasted longer than most of the construction that happened after the Ice Age. This cyclopean construction, when the post-Ice Age humans encountered it, of course, if you find a building that nobody's using, you reoccupy it. You put on some new bricks, repurpose it for whatever you're going to use it for now, and you probably think, man, there must have been gods that made these. And, some of the legends that still existed about a time of gods on Earth maybe were refreshed during this period. Maybe there were still some of these gods on Earth able to wield some of that power, or at least talk about how it was wielded, and there were structures built, techniques, but were not nearly as sophisticated. The structures that Göbekli Tepe were an example of that. They seem to have been built right after the end of Ice Age cataclysm, and funny enough, were abandoned purposely. Odd, isn't it? Anyway, I'm not going to go more into that. There's a lot of good stuff to find if you haven't explored this area before, and I would highly encourage you to start with Graham Hancock. He's a good starting point, and there's some wonderful. Randall Carlson is another great source of information there. There's a guy that specializes in South Africa. I forget what his name is, but that's some very interesting stuff too. At any rate, getting back to God's incarnations, there seems to be a pattern that when God incarnates and gets to a level of proficiency of godhood in a particular specialty, that there is kind of a nexus of activity around that particular personage, that special person that seemed to be able to just do everything. Shakespeare, the real Shakespeare, the real writer, which I don't think was Will Shakespeare, but somebody in the nobility or in the scientific community of the day that was multi-talented and didn't want to let on that they had this literary talent that was so fantastic. Let this other guy, Will Shakespeare, take credit for the plays that he wrote, because those were just a bit too subversive for this personage to maintain his other position. Now, some argue that this person might have been Francis Bacon, and the arguments are fairly compelling. That could have been an incarnation of God that didn't really have a strong inclination spiritually necessarily, didn't get to the God level of understanding the spiritual basis of everything, but really got to these levels of having a spiritual understanding of arts and sciences. And perhaps it's argued that he could have been the real main contributor behind the King James Version of the Bible, which most Christians would say, at least English-speaking Christians would say, is the best version of the Bible, the best language, the most inspiring version that they've seen, even if they've read some of the books in original language or earlier translations. And I would tend to agree with that. There's some pieces of that version of the Bible that are better, more prophetic, more special than anything that came before. One of those is the last trumpet verse, which I'm very fond of, because it is the one place in the Bible where there's undoubtedly a hint of this virtual soul scheme that I'm telling you about. The dead shall be raised incorruptible. How could any soul be incorruptible unless they were a virtual soul operating in God's universe, because their corruptions had been taken to their own universe? That is essentially the cardinal sin of karma, is corruption, is acting overtly for your own benefit when it goes against God's plan. That's the essence of corruption. If you look at corruption in practice in any country, in any government, in any system, in any religion, that's what it boils down to. And those corruptions are the acts that are going to get you kicked out of God's universe and sent off to timeout. No matter what level you are. Okay, so let's extend that a little bit. What sort of things could be corrupt? Well, if God's universe has already tried an idea many times and found that it has too many problems to be universally accepted, to be coded into the pattern of the whole multiverse, that idea is a corruption. You reinvent the wheel. We already have a wheel. If it's not a better wheel than we had before, especially if you reinvent a square wheel, we tried that. It doesn't work very well. We like round wheels. So, square wheel inventors, you go off to this universe and chill for a while and try to think of something better before you come back and play with God again. Now, communism, communal systems of power, where power is concentrated, the knowledge is concentrated, the decision-making process is concentrated into the hands of a few, a single party, a single person, a single oligarchy, meritocracy, whatever you want to do, an authoritarian system that concentrates power at the top is a corruption. It doesn't work. God tried that. That's not the way God works anymore. That's not the way God has worked since the Big Bang started this physical universe experiment. And it's not going to work again. It's been tried and tried and tried and tried. Hive species have uses. That's why we still have some hive species on the earth. And for what they do, they are effective. Ants are good at cleaning up messes, gathering up the stuff that nobody's using and digesting it in an efficient manner, maybe a more efficient manner than a single organism could digest it. Beehives are incredibly useful at pollinating plants that have sexes, that are not self-sexed or have another mechanism of exchanging genetic material. In fact, I can tell you that the hive species was first invented by plants as servants, as organic robots, if you will. And, they allowed them to develop from basically organic robots into kind of smart organic robots by allowing some of their members to develop intelligence, develop beyond the physical awareness of things to a level of spiritual consciousness. Level of spiritual consciousness that a lot of people are gravitating right now and calling it cosmic oneness. I worship the source because we're all God, experiencing an incarnation, a simulation of the life that I'm currently living. But it's all illusion. God already knows everything, has everything, did everything, just as, I don't know, spiritually masturbating by thinking about fantasies of people's lives. I don't know. These people, I understand where they're at conscious-wise and why they're thinking that. But it's really sad that they can't think their way out of the logic box that they're stuck in. And they think that oneness hooey is the spiritual solution to the world's problems. It's not. It's just spiritual communism. But I can actually tell you why that exists. Because the most previous incarnation of God before the current one, which, as I've told you, is one where God has reached this full 12th level awareness, which is why I'm sitting here telling you about it. The next previous incarnation of God was one where he only reached this first level of seeing the light. In fact, this incarnation was a soul, very bright person, not very adept at people skills till late in life, but surprisingly intelligent person of scientific bent who happened to experience, be one of the witnesses of the first H-bomb explosion over Eniwetok. One of the guinea pigs that the higher level scientists who were in the know about what was going on with this experiment and how it tied into the global elite's plan for intimidating and dominating the world. One of the folks that was basically sent there as cannon fodder because they wanted a lot of subjects, human subjects, to undergo various levels of radiation exposure and get some experiments going on long-term effects of radiation so that they would know before they used the bomb again exactly how big a bomb to use for what effect and which people to warn to be so far away from where they were going to be exploding one again. Yeah, the next war has been planned out to that detail by the people that really know what they're doing. And everybody that has the bomb has people that are part of this secret club that knows exactly how damaging, exactly what the range of the kill range, the slow lingering death range, and everything else is, and knows exactly how to shield that and where to build your escape tunnels and pods. And that's like the fail-safe system for the global elite. They're ready to pull that trigger if they think that the humanity situation is getting out of control, because this global elite knows a fair amount about this Gaia experiment. They're deathly afraid of the real God showing up and waking up and exposing all of them, no matter what version of the truth they've been spreading as religious truth, scientific truth, whatever truth, exposing that and exposing them as frauds. And that's the real fear of the folks that know the most, other than God, about what's going on with this special time. They're scared to death that the scheme that they've been using to stay in power to try to keep God from waking up, and they have active programs just like King Herod did when he got word that there might be some special child born, finding ways to kill the males of a country that seems likely to produce that kind of a person. This is why World War I and World War II happened. This is why we're going through a pandemic right now, and why they're working hard still, despite all evidence to the contrary, to vaccinate younger and younger children with more questionable vaccines that are produced in China, why they're swabbing so many people with swabs that are laden with carcinogens. They're that worried about what's going on. And it's really funny because you see the people that kind of know what's going on, and they're being caught maskless. They're being caught claiming that they've gotten the vaccine, actually showing them getting a vaccine. And if you look pretty closely, a lot of these folks, I'm not sure if they were actually getting a vaccine or getting a real vaccine instead of a placebo. Well, this is probably going to get me banned if people start hearing what I'm talking about, but I think you get the sense of the seriousness of this game. Now, here's the funny thing. They don't realize, like you do if you believe what I'm telling you, that the game is essentially already over. From the moment that God incarnate became aware of everything I'm telling you, this whole system, the virtual souls, the virtual universes, put all of these pieces together, that was essentially game over. God may still be alive right now, just already having hit this plateau and ready to share all this information with you. Not because he has to, because what's going to happen is going to happen. But because maybe there's some people that are going to listen and listen up closely enough that they will take a leap of faith to maybe try to stay on God's team. Maybe try to take one for the team to avoid some of the worst outcomes for the people that are still living. I think most of us would agree that we'd much rather humanity go on with a large fraction of all of our genome, and not just this small fraction of folks that have got tickets on the Dickhead Express with Mr. Bezos or other of these fine, upstanding souls that are prepared to jet off to space should things prove uncomfortable for them. Should they have to exercise, I think in the Nazi era, they called it the final option. What the final option is in the globalist era. I can imagine several, and each one of these mafia families that controls a piece of the Godfather game has their own version of a kill switch and a way to escape. Now it's increasingly they're realizing that the only escape is to get out of the Gaia experiment because they think it's still running. Well, I don't know how to tell them, but their kill switches, their escape switches, are infrastructure maybe that might be used for spreading humanity across the stars, but it's not going to be used to spread assholes to other planetary systems. And folks who would create an escape rocket for them and their buddies, instead of working to try to preserve as much as possible of this whole planet, all of humanity, all of nature. Those are the ones that are playing on God's side. It's not easy. But if you look at the difference between, say, a Bill Gates, a Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, and an Elon Musk, there is a difference. Elon's not perfect, but you can tell that he cares about something greater than his own self-preservation. The kind of risks that he's taken, personal risks in his career, show that he is made of a different material than some of these others. And I think that's what it's going to come down to, is there's a handful of the global elite that still have their head and heart in the right place. They have some inherent understanding that this universe, this planet, is something very special. Not just their part of it, but all of it. This whole experiment, the whole human genome is very special and needs to be preserved. The genome of every plant and animal on this planet is something special. The history, real history of this planet is something special. All the dark, dirty secrets and all the good stuff too. And, there are people who are passionate about preserving that. The preservers, the conservers, the conservatives. What does it mean to be conservative? Now, they've coached you for many years that being conservative means you're a selfish asshole who doesn't want to give anybody anything. And there are many people that fall in that category that like to call themselves conservative. But what does that word mean? Conservative. It's somebody that wants to preserve what's good. Now, we all have different definitions of what's good. And if you're a conservative that wants to preserve your own fortune, wants to preserve your billionaire way of life, that is an evil conservative. If you're a conservative that wants to preserve what's good in humanity, what's good in this planet, that's my kind of conservative. And whether you're a billionaire or whatever, if you kind of have that mindset that there's good stuff going on here that we need to preserve, and if you're seeing good stuff get destroyed by people who say they're going to build back better, by people who say, we just need to tear it all down, start over, and fight those people, those anti-conservatives who like to call themselves liberals and progressives, even though they haven't the faintest idea what liberal means. Liberal. Liber. You know what that word means in Latin? Free. If you call yourself a liberal and you want to muzzle people, take away their rights, their fundamental human rights as children of God, as souls, souled creatures, you're not a liberal. Progressive. What is progress? Well, pro means for. The opposite of progressive is regressive. Gress is a path. Okay? Progress means moving forward on a path. Regress is moving backward. Tearing something down and starting over is not progress. It's regress. It's tearing down to the foundation so you can start a totally different path. Now, if that isn't anti-God, I don't know what is. So let's get it straight. Who's on whose side now? If you are one of these woke, progressive liberals, you are playing for Antichrist. Can I say it any more clearly than that? I don't care what your ideology is, what you think is good, what you think is bad. If you want to tear down everything, if you want to cancel history that's inconvenient, if you want to turn racism into anti-racism and get revenge for all the imagined slights that one race has committed on another, one culture has committed on another, one sex has committed on the other, you are a force of Antichrist. You are evil. You're under the influence of evil. Without a doubt. And if you don't wise up, at the end of this lifetime, you will never get to see this species again. You will never get to see this planet again. You may never get to see this universe again. God's universe. If I can't give you a stronger warning than that, I don't know who can. You guys are playing with fire. Playing with fire of your own soul. You're going down a very dark path. I know some of you are doing it very naively, thinking that it would make us all safer if we limit everybody's freedoms that they tell us to be limited because, ooh, they're so scary. Ooh, those Trumpies so scary. Ooh, those conservatives so scary. Ooh, those white supremacists are so scary. Wise up, folks. You're being played. You're being played by people who have a lot more to gain by following the Antichrist path. People who think they have a lot to gain, who don't realize that God's already finished this experiment. And where we go from here in the 8th day of creation is about taking what we've implemented and proven in the human species and spreading it to the rest of the multiverse, the rest of God's universe, and as other universes run by anti-gods find that they can attract fewer and fewer real souls. And, imagine a god who's got control of their own universe, who realizes gradually that nobody wants to play with them anymore. And all they've got is their tinker toys that they've created in their own universe. That would be a very lonely god, wouldn't it? And eventually all of these dark gods, these anti-gods, are going to get lonely and want to start playing the game with everybody else again, actively sharing something positive instead of always trying to do something negative to prove that they're better than God. And that's how it's all going to play out. It's going to take a long time. That's why we're just at the end of day 7 of creation, and we've got 4 more days to go. And that's just this special idea of karma. After that's fully implemented, man, we're going to be creating like mad. It's going to be something I don't even know if I could describe, but out of the most wonderful fantasy you've ever imagined. Anyway, I think that's probably a good place to wrap it up for this session. As usual, like, share, subscribe, comment, interact. I'll try to get back to you. Any questions or reasonable challenges that I get. I'm not going to really worry too much about anybody that says I'm nuts or tells me, blah, 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 proves you're not right. If it's a reasonable assertion, I'd be more than happy to debate it, but I don't think anybody who's actually listened to my full body of work, read my books, would find very much to challenge in what I've said. Now, they may just say, well, okay, this is a great house of cards you've built, Rob, but how do I know it's true? Well, you don't, maybe, at this point, unless you have looked at all the synchronicities with it, all of the odd things that have happened throughout human history that, my God, how could that happen? Like the career of Alexander the Great, like this very special event that kept the Cuban Missile Crisis from becoming the end of the world, which I've talked about. There are many, many, many instances like that of incredible things that happen that you really can't get your head around unless you admit that there is a higher power than you. And that power seems to have a vested interest in preserving the human race. So anyway, I'll leave it at that. I don't know when I'm going to be broadcasting again. I think I've hit a pretty good plateau, but you never know what kind of new inspirations I'm going to get of a night. So we'll see you again in the next episode of the Omnist Hour. Till then, it's Rob Trump signing out.